The roast chicken was still warm when she said it. We'd been at the table for an hour. Soft jazz on the little speaker, crystal that caught the lamplight, the slow, familiar rotation of my hands folding a napkin, just so, because that's what I always did when someone else was hosting. The house smelled like rosemary and browned butter. Ethan laughed at one of Olivia's practiced jokes, and I felt, for a moment, the ordinary comfort of family. The clink of silverware, the steam rising from the platter, the safe, small orbit of our lives. Then Olivia leaned forward, smiled that bright, curated smile she keeps for her followers, and said, "We all love what you do for us, Margaret. You're our unofficial maid." It landed like a glove slapping my face, slick, absurd, meant to be witty, meant to be taken as a compliment. The room moved a degree off axis. For a beat, I searched my face in the polished surface of the wine glass. Ethan didn't look surprised. He kept chewing, kept nodding like someone watching a broadcast he's already muted. Olivia's fingers fluttered to her phone as if to capture the moment. An image for the feed, maybe. A caption for the next brand post. Humble homemaker. Modern aunt. I set down my fork. The china made a tiny, clear sound. My hands were steady. I thought of nights folding laundry after my shift at the clinic, of mortgage payments I had kept on time for years because I'd promised Ethan stability, of the way I'd taught him to tie his shoes, to read maps, to treat people with more kindness than he sometimes returned. Maybe it was the chicken, or the ridiculousness of the phrase, or all those years compressing into one small, humiliating sentence. Maybe it was every time my presence had been translated into unpaid labor, invisible and expected. Whatever the exact physics of the moment, my answer came simple and absolute. I reached for the keys that were where they'd always been, on the little dish by the entryway, next to the bowl of loose change and a scraggly address book. They were warm from my hand. I slid them across the table toward Olivia and said, "When my daughter-in-law called me the maid, I handed her the keys and said, 'Good luck with the mortgage.'" There it was, the title, the end of whatever small currency of currency and expectation had been between us. It was less a line than a hinge. The room inhaled. Olivia's smile faltered, like a screen buffering. Ethan's fork paused in midair. Someone's phone chimed in my peripheral vision. Olivia's hand flew to it as if she might edit her expression before it became viral. I pulled on my coat. The jacket felt like an armor I hadn't realized I owned. I kissed Ethan on the forehead in that absent maternal way I'd done since he was a baby, and then I left. Outside, the night was small and surprisingly cold. The porch light painted the sidewalk a narrow strip of eggshell. I walked away in a way that surprised me. Not running, not dramatic, just a steady, deliberate step forward. I did not look back. If this hits you, if you've ever been made invisible in your own home, if you've ever had the work of your life turned into a punchline, stay with me for a while. Subscribe and share this if it matters to you. There are more parts to this than that dinner, and there are truths that came out of the quiet afterward, which I couldn't have imagined at the table. The apartment Aunt Ruth left me was smaller than I remembered. A pocket of silence wedged between a laundromat and a linen shop on a strip of town that still had neon whiskey signs on Friday nights. The wallpaper still had that faded floral she loved. The heater in the corner coughed when I turned it on. It was precisely the kind of place that holds the smell of old books and boiled coffee, the kind that has room in it for someone to breathe finally. I took inventory in the way that people do when they're trying to name their losses. A mattress, a blue chair that sagged in the middle, a tiny table with one good leg. There was a trunk beneath the bed where Ruth kept things she couldn't bear to throw away. Old magazines, a box of toiletries, postcards from women who had been nurses with her during wartime stints, and one small square packet tied with yellowed twine. You can live a long time with a sense of being less than you are. You can give and give until your name is a verb in your household. Margaret will do that. And feel monstrously grateful and lightheaded with love. But there is a different air to being an unintended absence. That's what I felt that night as I sat on Aunt Ruth's kitchen chair with the packet in my lap. It whispered like a moth. Ruth's handwriting angled across the top of the packet. Old nurse's loops, a smudge of ink at the margin. Inside were hospital forms, carbon copies of a kind the modern world has made more efficient and less human. Letters that smelled faintly of mothballs and hospital disinfectant. A photograph of a newborn with my handwriting on the back. June 1989, taken down in 89, baby in Ward 2. There were medical reports. There was a settlement notice, the language dry and formal, and a hand-corrected entry that someone had underlined in pencil. And then a name, Michael Jameson. It is a peculiar thing when a paper can make your throat let go. I had raised Ethan, loved him, scrubbed his knees, paid for his scout uniforms and his graduations. I had been the anchor. All of that was true. But the paper in my hand suggested a different arrangement had been made by some other, quieter actor years before. An unnoticed clerk or a hospital bureaucrat with an overworked conscience who had left a trail. The old photograph was creased at the corners. The baby had a round face and a tiny fist clenched like a stubborn promise. I held the photograph up to the light until the creases blurred into a kind of map. On the back, in Ruth's hand, was an address. Michael's bookstore, she had written. The very place 2 blocks from my apartment where I'd browsed dust jackets without realizing anything had shifted just beneath my feet. I read and reread the papers with a kind of careful disbelief, the way you would study a paper cut for a long time to make sure it was real. There were columns of numbers that might once have been a settlement amount. There were notes about a switched at birth incident in language so clinical it nearly erased the human tenderness of the thing. The dates lined up with Ethan's hospital entry, with the timing of a neighbor's gossip I'd once brushed aside, with a memory of Ruth coming to my kitchen one afternoon and saying, "Some things never leave us, Margaret." Back then, I had been too busy making dinner to ask what she meant. It is a strange paradox to find that your history contains 2 truths at once, the truth of the life you raised and the truth of your bloodline. The documents didn't erase the years of laundry and lullabies. They offered instead an additional axis on which to view my life, a new frame that turned the world sideways and showed me a line I could follow. Ruth had been careful. The papers were organized, each envelope labeled in her orderly hand. Hosperson 89, settlement, photo. She had left me a small note tucked into the trunk, short as a knuckle. If you need it, you'll know. R. I pressed the note against my chest and felt, oddly, a pulse settle in my ribs. There was grief in the discovery, an initial splintering that went straight to the part of me that still wanted to be seen by Ethan as mother rather than helper. But there was also a clarity that arrived like daylight after a storm. The humiliation from Olivia's sentence thickened into something I could name: displacement. I thought of Michael, of the man in the bookstore with the soft laugh, the way he recommended poetry last winter when I'd said I was tired and wanted something to hold on to. He wore flannel and had the gentle patience of people who stand behind counters and know the rhythms of other people's lives. I had seen him a dozen times, bought a notebook, paid with a $5 bill, and left. I had never imagined a paper could connect us in the way this one had. For 3 nights I slept badly. The heater wheezed. My breath fogged the small window. In the morning I wrote, longhand, in a ledger Ruth used for keeping grocery lists. It felt like an incantation. I jotted down dates, names, questions that could become a map. Ruth's trunk, found, settlement, undated but likely 1989, hospital, Ward 2, Michael Jameson, bookstore address on Baker Street, Ethan, raised child, not biological, Olivia, public bragging, curated persona. The handwriting tasted like starting a fire. Everything that followed would need to be careful. There was a legal skeleton hidden in those papers, the sort of thing a lawyer could look at and say, "This indicates a previous claim." But I did not yet have a lawyer. I had a trunk, a photograph, and a small note that had been waiting years for me to notice it. The world had not yet agreed with my discovery. The world was still the world. Olivia still had her followers. Ethan still had his job. My mortgage, the one Olivia would now be carrying with her new keys, still sat as a practical ledger on the bank's books. But inside me, something had shifted from grief to purpose. The awkward, hollow outrage I had felt at the dinner table, the absurdity of being called the Maid, no longer felt like the center of my story. It was, instead, the thing that pushed me out the door and into a room where the truth could be found. I could choose to remain the quiet person who stayed in the background, who folded and cleaned and loved without question. Or I could turn a page. I began, clumsily and then with more intent, to assemble what Ruth's trunk had offered. I copied the documents onto a borrowed scanner at the library. I cataloged dates, underlined names, and typed them into a spreadsheet with a rigor I had never been taught but felt in my bones. Maybe it was because the spreadsheets promised a kind of order. Maybe it was because I'd been a nurse's aide for years, and maps of paperwork are oddly comforting to that kind of mind. People have asked me later whether anger pushed me then. Anger was in the room, sure, a small hot coal beneath my sternum. But the louder thing was an absolutely clear sense of boundary. I wasn't moving for vengeance. I was moving because the truth had unfolded in front of me, and it deserved to be treated with the same care I'd given Ethan when he skinned his knee. There was a moral arithmetic to it. If I'd been erased, if my name had been rendered as a service rather than as a person, I could, with these papers, insist on a different ledger. I began to watch in the way people watch to see patterns. From my small apartment, I observed the house across the street where Ethan and Olivia lived. At first, it was simply noticing the rhythm of their comings and goings. Olivia would leave in a flurry of printed patterns and carefully applied lipstick. Ethan would trail behind with a cardboard coffee cup. Olivia's posts on social platforms were a glitter of staged mornings and partner selfies. There was a curated ordinariness to it that made the ordinary invisible. The more I watched, the more I noticed small mismatches. A charity date on her feed that didn't match a receipt. A picture of a new business launch that didn't include any behind-the-scenes footage. It wasn't just a personality. There was a pattern of presentation designed to convince. I told myself then that anyone could get wrapped up in presentation, could build an image with air and a stylist. I also told myself I would not leap to accuse anyone without evidence. Ruth's papers were the only thing that had given me factual footing, a baby who belonged, by blood, elsewhere. Everything else required prudence. The first practical step, I decided, would be to make copies, to secure Ruth's trunk, and to start a journal of events, dates, things Olivia said in the house, things I remembered. Papers are patient, memory is not. I wanted an unarguable record for myself, less for the world and more as a way to teach myself that my life had weight. There is a way grief compels you to catalog. Names become anchors, dates become footholds. I made lists and taped them to the inside of my wardrobe door. I wrote down the exact phrasing of what Olivia had said at the dinner table and circled it until the ink bled. I wrote down the dates of my mortgage payments, the years I had worked nights to make sure the roof stayed on over Ethan's head. I wrote down the time Ruth had come to my kitchen with a jar of marmalade and sat down for a talk I didn't fully understand at the time. The list gave me back a shape. I tell you all this because the rest of what happened was not cinematic. There were not sudden confrontations or shouting on the steps. There were small, tactical moves that felt like a person learning to hold a spoon differently. I made a call to a lawyer, female, patient-voiced, who told me in plain language that old documents can be significant evidence. She asked me to bring the originals. I made an appointment. I did not say, at that first meeting, that I planned to turn the keys in the way I did at dinner. I said only that I had something I needed examined. The lawyer listened without interruption. "We will want to look at everything," she said, "but take it slow. There are legal steps, and there are human steps. She underlined the distinction in a way that felt compassionate. She did not promise outcomes. She promised clarity. That small, careful, legalistic advice was exactly what I needed. Not a fireball, but a method. I like method. I had raised a son, after all. I have always trusted orderly things. I started with small investigations. I made a list of the businesses Olivia mentioned on her posts. 1. Olivia Ascends LLC had a web presence and a stream of testimonials that felt conspicuously generic. There were a handful of customers who left glowing comments about a course they'd never fully described. I made note of it, typed it into my ledger, and told myself I wasn't a detective, only someone trying to understand what it meant that people's lives and identities could be built on curated confusion. Some nights I sat with Ruth's photograph and tried to envision the life of a child who might have been mine by blood. I thought about how different ways of being could have altered landscapes for different people. It was neither cruel nor indulgent. It was a human attempt to place possibility in a world that had seemed fixed. I would not, I told myself, make a spectacle of the revelations to come. I would not be cruel to Ethan. He was my son in all the ways that mattered, the ones that could not be transferred on a sheet of paper. But there was a new boundary I could no longer cross without consideration. The keys on Olivia's table were not merely hardware. They were the physical symbol of a contract, financial and emotional, that I had been expected to uphold without acknowledgement. Handing them over was not a dramatic break. It was a naming. I worked slowly, collecting the evidence Ruth had saved like one might collect a herd of wild horses. Carefully, with patience. I scanned the documents into 3 separate thumb drives and hid one in the lining of my coat and the others in my contact at the library. The lawyer asked for originals. I considered what it would mean to part with them and decided to bring the originals strapped in a flat cardboard portfolio, like a woman going to church. The days settled into a rhythm of small clarities. In the mornings, I would sort the trunk and make coffee. In the afternoon, I'd go to the library to scan. In the evenings, I'd sit with a cup and read back over the words, watching them slipped into the spreadsheet like tiles in a mosaic. There was a strange joy to it, the way a jigsaw puzzle finds its fit. I felt, in a quiet way, like I was working my hands toward a life I had not yet seen. One afternoon, as a pattern to my new life, I walked into Michael Jameson's bookstore with Ruth's photograph in my pocket. The bell over the door chimed a soft note. He looked up from behind the counter. Time had not hardened him. If anything, it had given his face a kind of patient openness. He smiled like someone who knows the names of all the books in his care. We exchanged a few tentative words about weather and new paperback arrivals. He recommended a book on small domestic rituals, and I bought it, my fingers brushing the startling truth in my pocket. There was, of course, a part of me that feared what this connection might mean for Michael. He was separate from the confusion of my household, from the curated image of Olivia. He ran a small shop and lived quietly. I could imagine the sacrificial architecture that had raised Ethan, late nights, patience, the small daily tenders that add up to a life. The papers told me that some version of that architecture had been invested elsewhere as well. The consequences of that being true were not villains or victims in my mind. They were real people with real hearts. When I finally opened my mouth to tell Michael, when I did tell him, I did it as delicately as one might hand someone a fragile bird. I did not push. I did not demand. I showed him Ruth's photograph and the papers in a quiet envelope, and I watched his face move through surprise to a slow, gathering thoughtfulness. He handled the documents as if he were touching something reverent. "Where did you get these?" he asked, voice small. "From Ruth's trunk," I said. "She left them to me." Michael's hands trembled a little as he held the photograph. You are never prepared for the way truth lands in another person's palm, light, weightless, and hot with consequence. He asked questions that were precise not because he wanted a fight, but because he needed to know whether his life belonged to him as he had lived it. We agreed to take time. We agreed to not announce anything. He asked for the documents to copy for himself. He promised he would not do anything rash. By the time I left his shop, dusk was dangling its blue scarf over the street. I walked home with the weight of what I had done pressing at my collarbone. There is a particular kind of stillness that follows a decision. It is not restful, it is watchful. I had crossed some small threshold, but the path ahead was not yet clear. There were more appointments to make, more copies to be taken, more legal conversations to have. There would be a day, I suspected, when I would stand again at a table and ask for a reckoning of sorts. But the immediate work was quieter, to gather and to hold. The rest of the city went about its business. A bus hissed by. Someone played piano in an upstairs window. I made soup and sat with Ruth's envelope by the sink, the lamplight catching that small crease on the photograph like a promise. I felt present in a bodily way I hadn't for years, not simply moving through tasks, but watching, thinking, planning. The humiliation from the dinner table had shifted into a careful, stubborn energy. People ask me now why I didn't confront Ethan in that moment, why I didn't drive back to the house and demand answers. The truth is, I needed steadiness more than I needed fireworks. Shouting at my son would have satisfied a hurt in the short term and would have left us both broken in the long one. Instead, I wanted to put the pieces in a place where truth could be engaged, slowly and responsibly. I made a list of the things I would need, copies of the documents, an audit of any businesses that might have financial discrepancies, if there were any, a lawyer who could speak plainly, and a friend or two who would serve as witnesses to the small acts of my life. I called an old friend from the clinic, Darren, someone who had a clear, practical mind and an eye for numbers. He agreed to look over public filings of anything Olivia had listed under business names. He didn't promise miracles. He promised accuracy. That was the most important thing an adult can promise another, to be accurate. I lay awake that night thinking of keys. Keys are tiny instruments of trust and contract. I'd given up one set at the table like a person putting down an old shirt. I did it not as a flourish, but as a boundary. I had been given a new thing, evidence and the possibility of a different story. With that came the responsibility to proceed honestly, with dignity. I had no desire to destroy anyone. I wanted to reclaim my life. In the days that followed, I moved between small, pragmatic acts and long hours of memory. I called the lawyer back and scheduled a meeting. I left Ruth's original note folded exactly as she had left it and carried copies of the other papers. At the library, the scanner hummed and coughed as it made clean digital echoes of yellowed typescript. Darren began to send me notes with the calm patience of a man who likes numbers. He found things that made me furrow my brow, but not in any way that would burn a person. He flagged irregularities in company filings, gaps that merited a second look, and he offered to consult more formally if I wanted it. Forming a plan felt like putting on a sweater. It both warmed and confined. It made the days bearable. I would take my time. I would be legal. I would be honest. I would not broadcast lives for spectacle. There was a difference, I had learned, between reckoning and revenge. But even as I focused on the documents, a private ache pulled at me. There were nights when I would sit and imagine Ethan as a small boy, and my chest would ache with the memory of lullabies and soccer games, and the way he once put his head against my shoulder to fall asleep. How do you reconcile such memories with the fact that shared blood had run elsewhere? The answer came slowly, by holding both truths without trying to fold one into the other. Ethan was my son in the only real way that matters, the way one finishes someone's sentences and knows their favorite sandwich. Michael was a man in the world who had roots that, on paper, began where I stood. The papers gave me a map. They did not erase the life I had. One morning, a week after the dinner, I found myself on the corner across from the house watching the curtains. A child with a backpack ran past, tugging a father in a red scarf. A neighbor came out with coffee and apologetically tapped a leaf from her shoe. The house looked ordinary from the street. That ordinariness was the complicated part. Ordinary is often where hurt lives, unseen. Ethan came out in his work shirt and glanced at me across the street. He hesitated. I lifted a hand in a small, chaste wave. No accusation, no drama. He ducked his head and didn't approach. That, perhaps, was the most difficult thing. The slow unwinding of proximity, not with sudden violence, but with the thin, surgical removal of expectations. I did not want to punish him. I wanted him to see that my life was not purely serviceable. There were practicalities to attend to as well. The mortgage remained a line in a ledger, indifferent to human sentiment. The house was still under my name in many of the records I'd begun to check. I was mindful of not overstating legal things I wasn't qualified to change. There would be honest, legal channels if it came to that. For now, my work was the quieter labor of collecting and understanding. The trunk had given me something none of us anticipated, a choice. The documents were a doorway from which a different life could be entered. That life did not look like a parade or a lawsuit or an exposé. It looked like mornings with a book, like coffee with a man who had once been a stranger, like donating part of any future proceeds to the women who'd helped me, who'd been like me. Unseen, unpaid, invisible labor. Sitting at the edge of Ruth's bed with the photograph in my lap, I felt a kind of pity for the life I'd been living, not because it had been unloving, far from it, but because I had been taught to define myself by what I did for others rather than by who I was. The documents did not erase those years. They simply allowed me to reframe them. I could keep my memories and also insist on a new future. That night I wrote a letter to Ethan. I read it over 3 times before folding it and tucking it into my jacket. I did not intend to hand it to him immediately. There is prudence in letting words sit. I wanted the letter to be a measure of my boundary, more than an instrument of accusation. It said plainly that I loved him, that I had found papers that complicated things, and that I would be in touch when I had clarity. It was short and not elegant. It was true. I placed the photograph back in Ruth's trunk and closed the lid like a woman who was, for now, sheltering something fragile. The plan was not yet full. Many actors had not yet played their parts. There would be more conversations, legal, personal, and procedural. There would be a confrontation of sorts, though I had no appetite for spectacle. I wanted a quiet resolution to the problem of invisibility that had lodged in me for decades. The next morning, a light rain stitched the city into a silvered shawl. I took the bus to the library, scanned the final documents, and sent Darren a note. "I have more. When can you come by?" He replied with a time and a short phrase. "I'll bring coffee." As I stepped off the bus, the smell of wet pavement lifted something heavy and sweet in my chest. The future felt like a stack of blank pages that were no longer empty, but were waiting to be written by my hand. I had set down a plate and walked out of a house. I had found a trunk that held a truth. I had met a man who might, in time, be something like family. And I had, quietly, begun to arrange for a life that belonged to me as much as to anyone else. There is a kind of courage in small, lawful acts. It is the courage to persist, to be accurate, to be patient. The rest of the story, how the house might move from one set of hands to another, what the audit would reveal about an online persona, and how Ethan would face the facts when he was ready, remained to be written. But in that silvered morning, with Ruth's envelope tucked in my bag and the echo of Olivia's laugh in my ears, I felt something settle into place. Not triumph, not even full peace, but a slow, steady reclamation. I walked into the bookstore to say hello to Michael and found him arranging a new shelf. He looked up and smiled in that same kind, reserved way. I handed him a small notebook, a silly, practical thing, and said, as if it were the only honest thing to say, "I think we should keep talking." He nodded, and the bell over the door chimed like a small benediction. Michael slipped the notebook into the pocket of his apron like a small private ritual. He tied a new label on a stack of poetry, and then looked up at me with that same steady, patient face. "Good," he said. "Let's keep talking." We did. Not every day, not like a fevered confessional, but in small increments that felt like stitches rather than rips. We met over coffee that wasn't much more than bad drip poured carefully, over afternoons when the shop was quiet, and customers asked for recommendations, and left with something heavier than they'd come in for. He told me about the way he learned to count by folding receipts at his first job. I told him about nights waking with a baby and making scrambled eggs he never ate. We moved forward with the slow courtesy of people learning one another. All the while, the practical work pressed on. Darren, who had always been good with numbers and even better with a calm voice, sent me an email that was almost too clinical to bear. He had gone through the filings I'd flagged for Olivia Ascends LLC, and he had dug into a few of the seemingly innocuous things that looked fine at first glance. His note did not scream scandal. It used the soft verbs accountants use: inconsistencies, unaccounted deposits, testimonial patterns that suggest non-specific sourcing. He also found a cluster of client complaints, refunds requested after promises of coaching that never quite materialized, and some vendor invoices that looked like they'd been recycled across months. He printed the report and slid it into the folder I'd started to carry like a talisman. "This is not the kind of thing that makes a headline on its own," he said over coffee, "but it is the kind of thing a lawyer will want to see. It's irregular. It's a thread. Pull the thread and you'll see." He folded his hands like a man placing pieces on a board. "I can testify to what I saw if it comes to that." I felt both the small thrill and the small dread of officialness. Irregularities were not the same as guilt. They were evidence that more attention was merited. Darren's detachment steadied me. He wasn't comfortable with melodrama. He was comfortable with truth. The lawyer, Anna, had the soft, businesslike precision that I liked. When I arrived at her office with the flat cardboard portfolio containing Ruth's originals, she placed them carefully on her desk as if they were fragile panes of glass. "We'll proceed legally," she said, and that phrase felt like a quiet blessing. She explained the options without painting them as weapons. She spoke of listing the property rather than taking back the house. She spoke of disclosure and negotiation rather than triumph. She said things like, "There are steps we can take," and "We will try to limit harm." Her woman's voice never raised. It did not need to. She asked me a constellation of practical questions. Was the deed in your name? Are there recordings of the mortgage being paid by you? Are there co-signers? And I answered as patiently as I could. There were the muddled edges of records, she told me, the sort of bureaucratic fog that waited for patient hands and clean copies. "We'll prepare a packet," she said. "We'll prepare the listing. We will be honest. We will be firm." I remember how Anna said honest, as if it were a small candle she was keeping lit. That manner of work suited me. My life had been built out of honest work. This was a different kind of honest work. I left her office with a list of things to do. Let her make copies, draft an outreach brief to the bank, and advise on formal notices to the occupants. She did not offer trophy language or promises of immediate victory. She offered process. Olivia, when she noticed the first tremors, reacted the way carefully curated personas do. At first in staged indignation, then in a flurry of answers that looked rehearsed. She posted a video with the sort of tight smile that people like her learn to practice. "We've had a misunderstanding," she said. "Family matters are private." But beneath the practiced calm, there were small fissures. Followers asking pointed questions in comments, old customers seeking refunds via direct messages, a sponsor pausing a contract while they reviewed the situation. The pattern Darren had flagged became, for her, a slowdown in cash flow and a quick unspooling of brand certainty. I did not revel in that. I watched it, yes, because it was part of the evidence that life had a way of aligning with truth, but I also felt a long shadow of pity. Olivia had built an identity that required admiration to exist. When admiration thinned, it left her exposed in a way that felt raw to witness. I had been called our unofficial maid in a room of laughter. I had left not to watch someone fall, but to make a decision about my life. Watching the consequence was not the same as harming someone. It was watching systems correct themselves under scrutiny. The day Anna told me we were ready to proceed was not dramatic. It rained, a soft, persistent drizzle that made the city glisten like a blouse reasoned by light. She had prepared the listing packet and the notice we would publish. "We file the paperwork," she said. "We ensure your disclosures are documented, and we make sure anyone who lives at the property has proper notification. This is not about spite, it's about clarity." I remember standing in the doorway of my apartment that day, with Ruth's photograph pressed into my palm, and feeling like a woman holding a map. Maps, I decided, don't guarantee destinations. They only show the possible routes. I could not know how quickly things would change. I only knew that I wanted them to change legally, honestly, and without spectacle. There was a time, shortly after the listing was quietly filed, when I realized that the most wrenching part of the entire process wouldn't be paperwork, but the human moments, the little conversations that required a delicate hand. Ethan's knocked at my door like a man who'd rehearsed his need. He was wet from the rain, hair clinging to his forehead in damp strands. His eyes had that same tiredness I'd always known, but with something else layered over them, a kind of embarrassed panic. He wrapped his hands around his coat as though it might anchor him. We sat at my small kitchen table, with the kettle moving toward a quiet whistle. He didn't come with the accusation I might have expected. He came with apology, with raw confusion. "Margaret," he began, and his voice warmed like bread. "I didn't know. He stopped, and then his hands found Ruth's photograph on the table, as if the object were a lever he could pull to understand what he had always believed. I took the envelope Anna had suggested I hand him. It was not part of a public reveal. It was a private, inviolable transfer of fact to the person most implicated. He opened it with hands that had known every child's school permission slip, and prom permission, and prescription slip. He read, and then read again. His face, so easygoing and habitual in its expressions, collapsed into something small and brittle. "I'm so sorry," he said at last, the words as much to himself as to me. "I should have. God, I should have asked. I should have been more. Saying I raised you felt both immense and inadequate. The things that bind a parent and child do not dissolve because ink says otherwise. There are years of tucking in, of whispers at night, of filling pockets with change. You can rearrange the biology of belonging on paper, but not the way a human heart keeps another's birthday in their memory." Ethan's sorrow was not a single narrative. There was grief for the truth, shame for things untreated, and a dawning awareness that his marriage was built on an unpaid, invisible labor that I had long provided. He looked at me with an apology that needed a horizon. "I don't know how to make this right," he said. "You don't have to make it right tonight," I told him. "You have to do one honest thing at a time." I did not ask him to leave his marriage then. I did not demand theatrical renunciations. I set boundaries that would hold us both safely. I told him I loved him, that he was my son, and that I would not return to being unseen in his household. I told him I would be available to talk, but only if it would be helpful and honest. He nodded like a man beginning to rebuild after an earthquake. Later, after he had left, I sat at the window and watched him walk down the sidewalk with the stoop of a man who had been rearranged. He didn't run after me. There was no melodramatic scene. There was instead the slow, necessary work of two adults learning to live with a new map of who they were to one another. Meanwhile, Darren's audit rippled. He offered, sensibly, clinically, to compile a formal report that Anna could use in whatever legal conversations we needed to have. He did so in the kind of language that made my stomach both tighten and settle. Numbers, dates, receipts, testimonial inconsistencies. That kind of evidence is not theater. It is a tool. Anna used it to request documentation from Olivia's business. There were letters circulated. There were polite but firm requests for clarification. Olivia responded initially with broad denials and pledges of miscommunication. Then, as vendors began to email about chargebacks and followers posted screenshots of unfulfilled promises, her answers grew thinner. At no point did I call for punishment. I did not need to stand at a pulpit and pronounce judgment. My work was to be honest and to let the structures of accountability do what they'd been designed to do when systems fail: adjust. And yet, there were intimate human consequences. A woman who had once winked at me across the dinner table now stood in my path at the grocery store with the haunted expression of someone who'd lost a costume. We passed one another with the kind of civility that a shared grocery aisle affords. "Margaret," she said once, voice tight, "this has gotten complicated." "It has," I agreed, and then I kept my shopping list pressed between my fingers like a shield. It would be disingenuous to suggest there were no days when the old discomfort returned in force. The habit of being the one who does things for other people is a muscle that doesn't dissolve overnight. There were boxes I still found myself folding for neighbors, but I would fold them now with the knowledge that my time and energy had been hard-won. I kept track of the small ways I said no and the gentle new ways I said yes, to Michael's invitations for coffee, to Anna's small scheduling requests, to Daphne at the community center, who needed someone to read at an after-school hour. The house listing, when it went public, was handled with the kind of discreetness Anna had insisted on. It was not posted as spectacle. It was listed as a legal and financial fact, with statements about status and disclosures that felt like the careful stitches of a seamstress. I did not stand at the front and declare triumph. I walked the neighborhood and mailed a polite notice to Ethan and Olivia's address, the kind of thing that contained the dignity of formality. Offers arrived in a steady, practical way. The house had always been in a decent school district and had old bones that a buyer with patience could love. We accepted an offer that seemed fair and honest and closed the deal with the efficiency of banking hours and signed pages. I did not parley the sale into vengeance. I accepted it as a closing of a chapter. Part of the proceeds, after taxes and fees and the practicalities of life, went to a cause that mattered to me, a small, local foundation that helped women start over, offering short-term housing assistance, micro-grants for retraining, and free counseling. The donation was a quiet statement of intention. It was not an attempt to heal a world single-handedly. It was simply my way of saying, I have the means to help. I will. There were people who read that decision as theatrical. They called it symbolic. Some called it grand. I chose to call it necessary. There was a satisfaction that felt like a worn hand slipping back into the sleeve of a cardigan. I felt, after years of being defined by the work I did for others, a new authoring of my own life. In the midst of these pragmatic motions, Michael and I continued to find small ways to be in one another's company. He invited me to read at a small Sunday evening gathering he hosted at the bookstore, a night of local readers, of people who had stories folded into the spines of their books. I read a short piece I had written, honest, imperfect, about a woman who rearranged her life after being called by a wrong name. People clapped politely and told me afterward how brave I was. I thanked them, bewildered by the tenderness of strangers. The bookstore became a place of liminal belonging. Michael gave me a corner to call my own, a narrow shelf near the back where I could place books I loved, notes I wanted to share, a small framed photograph of Ruth. He pushed across the counter one afternoon a small brass key, simple, a little tarnished at the edges. I thought you might like this, he said. It's the key to the little reading nook. Consider it a next chapter. It was hardly the dramatic coronation of a new life. It was a small human gesture that felt like the closing of a circle. I pressed the key into my palm and felt the weight of possibility. There is a modest heroism in the non-dramatic. I think now that so much of our cultural imagination wants a shout, a battlefield, a single victorious moment. My life, instead, amended itself in small acts. I made lists, I scanned documents, I wrote letters, I sat with people who needed time, I donated money, I said no. Each of those felt like a stone lifted, one by one, until there was space to see the horizon again. Ethan tried, in the months that followed, to find his way back to a rhythm that included responsibility. He separated, then had months of messy, human deciding. He called sometimes to ask how I was. He showed up with his hands empty but his face open, and we spent a few afternoons talking about small things, the right way to prune a rose bush, what to do with an old apron, which recipes you keep even when the cook is tired. We made space for each other. He did not expect forgiveness as instant currency. He asked for the chance to be better. That was all I wanted, not to be paid back for a lifetime, but to be recognized. Olivia's fall from her curated pedestal was neither swift nor theatrical. She made earnest attempts to repair what she could, refunds to some clients, a statement about learning, a video in which she cried on camera and promised to do better. Whether she understood the harm her performance had caused, I could not know. I felt a measure of compassion for the person whose identity had been tied to public affection, and then frayed. I held my own distance not as punishment, but as protection. Legalities sorted themselves in a sober domestic way. Signatures, forms, an accountant's ledger that no longer included my name in the way it once had. I signed the final papers and handed them over like a woman returning a library book she'd finished with. There was no applause. There was only the sense of something completed. After the house sold and the donation went out, I sat with Ruth's photograph on my lap and thought of the strange mosaics a life becomes when you step back and look at it. There are tiles of love and tiles of error, and sometimes they fit together in a pattern you didn't expect. I had been given a new piece to fit into a map I had been tracing for years. I had been given the chance, late, perhaps, but not too late, to author an ending that began with dignity rather than with erasure. Michael and I built a kind of friendship that was root-like, quiet, slow, with small shoots of conversation that reached toward intimacy. We were not people in a rush. We shared a table at the bookstore and sometimes rearranged the chairs for story time. He introduced me to the man who ran the local repair shop. I gave him a stack of Ruth's recipes, the ones that involved butter and an unashamed amount of salt. We traded stories in the way people who intend to keep one another do, with patience and with the knowledge that most things take time to say properly. I began, at some point, to write with more intention, not with the aim of fame or vindication, but simply to put words around the experience so that it could be shared without making spectacle of other people. Writing anchored me in a way that paperwork did not. It was quieter, more intimate, a different kind of ledger. I wrote about small acts of courage, setting a boundary, asking for help, honoring a person in ways that do not cost them their dignity. I wrote for myself and for the women I knew from the clinic who had given and given until their own edges had frayed. A local journal published a short piece of mine about domestic invisibility and the quiet dignity of setting boundaries. It felt oddly like a confirmation, but not one I needed to hoard. There were times, in the quieter months, when a neighbor would knock and ask me to water their plants while they were away. I would do it, but I would do it on my terms, with a schedule I chose. The small freedoms tasted sweeter for being hard-won. I could make soup for myself and not for the benefit of anyone else. I could buy a scarf I liked rather than one that went with the sofa. These were small things, yes, but they were a different grammar of living. When the season turned and the trees in the little park by my apartment went to a fever of gold, Michael invited me to a small fair he co-hosted at the bookstore. The community gathered around tables like old friends. He put his hand on my shoulder once, brief, steady, and later presented me with a small plaque that said simply, "For Margaret, who taught us how to be seen." I laughed because it was absurd, and then I sat with the absurdity until it landed in my chest like a tiny warm object. People sometimes ask whether I hold resentment for those who reduced me. The answer is complicated, and I tell it honestly. There were days when I felt anger that glowed bright and hot, but anger alone is not a life. I learned to let the heat cool into purpose. I learned to measure my responses with compassion, hours and boundary days. Holding someone accountable and holding them at the same time in a posture of fragile human sympathy are not mutually exclusive. It took a long time to find that balance. The bookshop corner, my reading nook, became a place of gatherings, people reading aloud, women trading recipes, a place where someone could sit with a cup and a book and be quietly not invisible. I donated a small shelf of cookbooks and a few memoirs that had mattered to me. The plaque stayed on the wall near the entrance, tarnishing at the edges in a pleasing way, as if it had been there forever. There was a particular afternoon I remember well. It was raining lightly, as if the weather and I had come to the same quiet understanding. Michael and I sat on the back steps of the bookstore eating sandwiches he'd somehow heated on a portable grill he insisted on carrying. He handed me the brass key again and said, "You made this corner." He did not offer anything I didn't know. No grand promises, no sweeping claims. He offered the steady companionship that feels like enough. "I didn't expect any of this," I said. "But I paused, looking for the word. "I don't regret finding the trunk." "Neither would Ruth," he said. "She always seemed like a keeper of things that mattered." We both laughed at the small, fitting truth of that. It felt like the kind of laughter that stitches two lives into a neighborly duet. When the months had settled and the storm of publicity and paperwork had quieted, I began to think of the world in slightly different terms. The phrase Olivia had thrown across the table that night, "our unofficial maid," wasn't a title I allowed to land on me again. It became instead a memory that taught me where not to stand. The small acts that followed, making copies of documents, hiring a lawyer, donating proceeds, were not trophies. They were the plain mechanics of turning a wound into a lesson for the future. There are things I would tell anyone who has ever been made to feel invisible in their own home. First, keep track. Paper is patient. Second, surround yourself with people who tell you what is true and do not amplify gossip. Third, be kind, but not at the cost of your own self-respect. And finally, allow yourself the modest, merciful joy of starting again. In the end, the story did not resolve into a single satisfying moral. Lives are rarely tidy in that way. Ethan and I found a new footing that involved honest conversation and slow rebuilding. Olivia found her own ways to face her work and her past, sometimes stumbling, sometimes candid. Michael and I found companionship that was neither urgent nor possessive, just two people building a small life in the margins of a city that kept spinning. I found, perhaps most of all, myself. I keep Ruth's photograph on the little shelf by my bed. Sometimes I take it down and trace the crease with my thumb. I think of her careful hand and the note she tucked into the trunk. "If you need it, you'll know." And it feels now like an instruction as much as a comfort. When I look back at the dinner table now, I no longer see only humiliation. I see a hinge. I see a moment that could have passed as an insult and instead became a doorway. I handed over keys that night, and in doing so, I unlocked a path I had not expected to take. I did not aim to punish. I aimed to be honest. That honesty led me to more than legal clarity. It led me to a life I could author on my own terms. If you have been made invisible, know this. There is a way back that does not require you erase the years you gave. You can hold your memories and also insist on a life that recognizes you. Boundaries are not vengeance. They are the smallest, truest forms of self-respect. If this story touched you, please leave a comment and share something of your own. What boundary you wish you'd set sooner, or a small act that changed the course of your life. I read every message, and I value the quiet community that forms when people brave enough to speak gather without spectacle. One last note. Out of the sale of that house, I donated a portion to a local foundation that helps women begin again. Short-term housing, small grants for retraining, and counseling services. I did it not to absolve the past, but to build a future where more of those small beginnings exist. If my choice inspires you in some small way, share this story. Let it travel to someone who needs to know that leaving a table is sometimes the beginning of a very different life. I do not pretend to have all the answers. I only know that when my daughter-in-law called me the maid, I handed her the keys and said, "Good luck with the mortgage," and then walked into a life I got to name for myself. The keys have opened many doors since then, some practical, some gentle, and some tender. There is peace in that. There is also work. And there is the odd, quiet joy of a woman who finally owns the right to her own story.